Chapter 16 of The Beautiful Mrs. Davenant by Violet Tweedale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. Sadie Hall Sees the Future. As Warburton passed out, the master of foxhounds and his wife were shown in, and Mrs. Davenant, with perfectly disguised astonishment, rose to receive them. Captain Hall often dropped in at all sorts of odd hours, in fact, whenever he could frame the flimsiest excuse for doing so, but Mrs. Hall paid her calls in a more formal manner.
"We aren't frightfully muddy, and we killed in the West Copse after a rattling good run.
Now we've come to beg for some tea," she exclaimed. "We've sent the hounds and horses home and ordered the car to come for us in half an hour." "Oh, how delightful of you! We'll have tea immediately," replied Mrs. Davenant, ringing the bell. "Now, let me introduce to you Miss Thorne of the Lake House, and Mr. Harry Thorpe, also of the Lake House, but at present domiciled at the White Hart." Sadie Hall wheeled round. In the twilight darkness of the room she had not observed the lovers. Now they sprang into prominence as Miss Howard switched on the lights. She had heard a great deal of country gossip concerning them both, and her vivid face betrayed the interest she felt. "Oh, very pleased to meet you," she said genially, in her frank American way, and offering her hand. As the master at her elbow followed suit, her sharp eyes flashed over Letty with quick penetration, and noted the pearls at her throat. She was instantly aware whose property they had been, and her curiosity was greatly stirred by the discovery.
We always regret that the lake house is closed. Seems such a waste, a fine old place like that,"
Captain Hall was saying.
"Well, if Letty and I survive Geoffrey Thorpe, we'll do our best to restore it to its former glory, and I promise you the doors will be thrown open wide to you all with the heartiest good will."
Harry's words dropped into a momentary silence with startling effect, and Jim Hall instantly grasped the situation.
"By Jove, so that's how the land lies. I'm delighted. Warmest congrats. Of course I knew you were the heir, but you've been such a shy bird I've never been able to lay salt on your tail. Best of luck to you, Miss Thorne, and may I live to see you reigning at the lake house. It needs a touch of youth badly. The old boy's something of a trial, I fancy, what, eh?"
In the cross-current of cheery questions and answers they went into the tea-room and disposed themselves around the softly lit table. Mrs. Hall, whilst proceeding to make a hearty meal, found herself, not for the first time, envying the quiet luxuriousness of little Glentworth. Housekeeping seemed to have been brought to a fine art in that establishment, and its ordered quiet was in marked contrast to the racket always going on at Yearlingham.
"I envy you your cook, Mrs. Davenant," she exclaimed, helping herself to a couple of foie gras sandwiches. "My cook is, alas, a hired assassin, and the kitchen girls are minxes. I'm certain the butler's a Labour leader. I caught him reading the Daily Herald, and the footmen are pure Bolsheviks. They've turned Yearlingham into a Soviet. Even the Pekingese are affected by the revolutionary atmosphere. They're the most disobedient little brutes in all the animal kingdom."
"Oh, it's not an easy job to be a good landlord now," chimed in her husband. "Looks as if the kids would all be paupers. Every jack one of 'em will have to learn the trade. The old country's done, they say, but there's still lots of foxes."
Mrs. Hall had fallen into silence, whilst the master ran on in his serio-comic fashion. The visit paid to her by the two Americans had enormously stimulated her interest in her present hostess. Gossip, always busy with the ladies of Little Glentworth, had not interested her much, but the few words dropped by Griffith and Lycett at the Carltons' dinner-table had been enough to confirm her belief that some dark secret enveloped the lives of Mrs. Davenant and Miss Howard. During the drive home from the dinner-party she had frankly questioned Colonel Lycett.
"Did you ever hear of Mrs. Davenant in Washington?" And the concise answer had been, "Never." Major Griffith was equally non-committal, but his quiet disclaimer of any knowledge of the ladies in question had not satisfied the nimble wits of Sadie Hall. She saw something suspicious in his extreme reticence. He had known a man named Thorpe of the Lake House in Washington, but she dreamed of no connection between the defunct scamp and Mrs. Davenant, and did not push her inquiries further in that direction. The next day Lord Leicester had come to lunch. He achieved no success with the Americans, but because of this rebuff he had been rather more open than he had intended with Mrs. Hall. As they strolled round the gardens together he did not read to her Bellow's letter, but he hinted very broadly at its contents.
"You can see how greatly attracted Claudia is," he had said, in extenuation of his statements. "One naturally wishes him to marry a woman unencumbered by an unpleasant past. One is not even sure in this case of the lady's real name."
Mrs. Hall had agreed, whilst her mind was busily conning over the names of her friends and acquaintances in Washington to whom she meant to apply for information. She was guiltless of any mean jealousy, and she honestly liked what she saw of Mrs. Davenant. But it might, she calculated, be as well to have something in reserve, as Claude Carlton was not the only man who felt the beauty's strong attractions. Meanwhile she determined to see more in future of the lady in question, and she had herself suggested turning into Little Glentworth for tea, when the hounds killed on the border of its woods. It had been quite a pleasant surprise to find Letty Thorne and her lover quite at home in Mrs. Davenant's drawing-room. Rumour had already announced their engagement, but Sadie had not chanced to set eyes on either of them before, and now she liked what she saw and was ready to be on friendly terms. "Tell me," she said in her direct way, "is Mr. Thorpe likely to live long?"
"For the next 20 years," promptly replied Harry, whom she had addressed.
Her face fell, and she threw up her hands. "Oh, what a misfortune! I never pretend to wish anything but the removal of such wretched lives. I want to see you and your fiancé installed as soon as possible."
"That's hardly a matter we can arrange," returned the amused Harry. "I quite see all the changes I'll make in the old place, but I don't count on dead men's shoes. Quite conceivably Geoffrey Thorpe may outlive me and Letty."
"He won't. He'll be dead within the next 3 months," she retorted, with a strange ruminative little laugh. Something in her manner threw a spell of amazed silence upon the little group round the table, and she found her curious retort being taken very seriously. "Those sort of things often come to me," she added quietly. "Are you a clairvoyant?" asked Miss Howard, breaking in on the amazed hush. "I believe so." She spoke with a reluctant drawl. "Impressions come to me, and they're generally right. I believe that Geoffrey Thorpe will be in his grave before New Year's Day."
"I'll bet my bottom dollar on that, if Sadie says it," declared her husband solemnly. "She's a stunner at spotting winners."
"Then she's a gold mine," said Hilda, who was desirous of turning off the conversation onto lighter lines. Mrs. Hall shook her head. "Alas, my impressions won't come at call. They just filter in. But when they do come in, well, they come off," she ended with dry abruptness. All Mrs. Davenant's efforts to alter the trend of thought that swayed Sadie Hall were in vain. The American possessed a streak of genuine mysticism, which had found itself transplanted in very uncongenial soil, but it never really perished, and at odd times asserted itself very strongly. Something in the atmosphere that evening had roused it into life. Possibly it was Letty Thorne's presence, her connection with the lake house and its uncanny traditions. Possibly it was the strong attraction that she at once felt for Harry Thorpe that had caused her to prophesy. While striving to give her attention to the master's harmless chatter, Hilda Davenant kept one ear open to Harry's silly expansiveness, as she mentally termed it. He was rather prone to be taciturn and non-responsive where his family was concerned, but now he was talking in the most candid manner about the former owners of the Lake House property, and Mrs. Hall was drinking in every word with absorbed attention. "Had my father lived, he'd have succeeded before me, but he died before Mark Thorpe. Mark went down at sea after a very discreditable career. He had to leave this country and he went to America. There he got into more troubles, money and women. He was, I've heard, a most plausible adventurer, and he had a rather serious affair with a beautiful actress called Lambert, or some such name. There was a scandal, and he married her, but luckily they had no children." "It never answers when the lady of the manor springs from the boards," remarked Sadie. "But you know, women always will run to extremes both in love and hate. It doesn't surprise me that a man like Mark Thorpe got some woman into his toils. Doubtlessly he got many, for heaps of us would really love to run over the rim of the world and drop into space, just to see what it looks like on the other side. There's nothing so boring to women as the happy medium." When Mrs. Davenant's guests had taken their departure, Agnes Howard turned to her with a gay little air of amusement. "Well, the country hasn't cut us yet, Hilda. We've had quite a number of callers this week." Mrs. Davenant did not answer for a moment. She sat looking down, one slender hand covering her eyes, and when she did speak her voice was very grave. "I heard Harry telling Mrs. Hall that Mark Thorpe had married in Washington an actress called Lambert, and that there were no children to succeed him when he died." For a moment Agnes looked as grave as her friend, and then suddenly she smiled again. "Oh, what of it, my dear? The name Lambert has no significance here. Why be anxious about nothing? Your fears are groundless. Colonel Lycett would never give us away, of that I'm convinced. He's left Yerlingham, and the skies haven't fallen." Mrs. Davenant rose to leave the room. She gave a gesture of weary impatience. "Oh, I really don't care one way or the other. Don't let us talk of it any more." When the door had closed, Agnes Howard gave a deep sigh. "Oh, yet she does care most awfully, alas," she whispered to herself, "and I know why." Mrs. Hall occupied alone the inside of her car, and she gave herself up to deep thought as they sped homeward. Lambert, yes, I'm sure that was the name Lester mentioned, and he said Davenant might not really be her name. Thorpe married a Washington actress called Lambert, and he was drowned at sea. At the Carltons' dinner, Mrs. Davenant owned to having been in Washington, and those fine pearls the girl was wearing. Who really is that girl? Why does Mrs. Davenant take so deep an interest in her? Such were the questions Sadie Hall turned over and over in her mind, but she determined to solve the mystery alone, and to share her suspicions and conjectures with no one. End of chapter 16.